Dun, 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 dun.
Okay, here we go.
Here we go.
All right, friends. Oh, I've got echo. I'll put my headphones in.
Yeah.
This is how this is going to work. Orion and I are going to try and keep the arguments unusually short such that we can have rebuttal, and then halfway through we'll flip sides. Okay. So don't just vote for the side you agree with. Watch the end because we're both going to be fighting for it. All right. So the government should help the homeless more than it does. Well, I feel like this is an easy place to start. Homelessness sucks, and it's not just a problem for the homeless. It's actually a problem for everyone else as well. If you live in cities with mass homelessness, there's like greater proliferation of things. It's like crime, because there are like quite easy targets to steal from. They often become the victims of assault. There's also lots of other problems like just like garbage and public urination and all sorts of just everything a city doesn't want happens when there are more homeless people there, because it's not necessarily their fault. There's just no other option. And so the government should probably be invested in, I'd say, probably like a zero tolerance policy on homelessness. There's no good reason why anyone should stay homeless. They should fund like public housing, or they should fund those things they did in one American state where they just give them a house, like for, and then, fix the problem. So obviously not super detailed stuff, but I just don't understand why anyone would tolerate any homelessness. Over to you, Orion.
All right, sounds good. So obviously there are a lot of circumstances that can lead to people being homeless. That is going to be a problem. My argument that I'm going to make here is that so when saying that, like, that the government should help the homeless more than it does, I think it might be a bit difficult. Can you hear me all right, by the way? Is my audio?
Yeah.
Excellent.
There's no choo-choo train this time.
Wonderful. I think it might be a little bit difficult for me to sit here and say that that everything is just fine as it exists in the status quo. So I think that what would be a fair sort of contention to say here is that by the government helping the homeless more than it does would imply some amount of additional funding going into homeless.
Just to be clear, I'm going to stand for like a zero tolerance homelessness.
Okay.
If there's homelessness, the government should do more. That way we don't have to debate about which governments are currently doing what.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. That sounds good. Well, what I'm going to stand for is that I think that there are a couple of conditions that the government can set up with that will drastically help people find their own way out of homelessness, and that if that after these conditions have been met, the state has alleviated itself of its responsibility to intervene in these particular ways. And the basic premise of this argument is going to be that there are actually a lot of things that the state does already that just makes things harder for homeless people as it exists. I think that if they just stop doing that, people can probably, figure themselves out to some degree or another. And then the instances of people where that isn't able to happen, the state has relieved itself of its responsibility to do that. So basically what I would say is that here are a couple of pieces of policy that does not cost the government any additional money. In fact, in some cases are revenue building, but I think would go a long way to helping people find their own way out of homelessness. First thing I'm going to propose is that we should get rid of the minimum wage. I think that there are a lot of people who are currently living on the streets who are unable to find meaningful employment because, in a lot of these cases, they might be unskilled or not have, current qualifications or things like that. So I think that if you give these people more opportunities to find some amount of employment, that there will be people who will be willing to hire them. I think that, that if you kind of price them out of being able to do this and don't make it efficient enough for small businesses to hire these people, then you just get a lot of people that end up on the streets. And I think that in a lot of cases, some money is better than no money, and that at least if people are able to feed themselves, then that's going to be a good thing. I think in terms of other specific government regulations that specifically make things harder for homeless people, I would say that in any kind of public infrastructure spending that they would do, that they stop building in anti-homeless measures into that. So I'm saying no more park benches that have dividers so people can't sleep on them. No more spikes that sit underneath overpasses and stuff so people can't sleep there. This is clearly just additional spending that people do to not actually sort of do anything other than try to push this problem to this other sort of area, which actually pushes it into sort of nicer areas, which means that you get these sort of problems that you were talking about. I think if you just let things exist so that people can camp out under them, that's going to be fine. I think that there's also just a lot of red tape that exists around things like sort of zoning and like loitering and stuff like that, that I would decriminalize all of that. I think that there's no good reason to go up to arrest someone just because they're having a bit of a hard time with things. Just leave them alone; they'll be able to figure out their own sort of stuff. So
Okay.
I don't think that I think that under these conditions, then you have people able to find an all right time of sort of getting by, and then you also have a lot of charities and other things that are going to be able to step in and probably have a bit better sense of what to do to be able to help people out. Boots on the ground, more experience with what's going on. And I think that a combination of these factors is going to help lift people out of the situation.
Okay, look, this is the first thing I'm going to note, Ryan, that like barely any of that was a path out of homelessness. Like they're like, oh man, they can sleep on the park benches now. That doesn't give them a job or a house. Get real. Most of what you're talking about just makes sleeping at rough slightly more comfortable, which I don't for a moment accept is a path out of homelessness. And I get that it's cost saving in that, oh man, they don't have to build those spikes anymore, but hardly in a significant way. The one thing you did point out, which I guess could be considered a path out of homelessness, was abolishing the minimum wage. First problem with that is that that's not cost saving. That actually costs so much money. And you can tell why, right? Like when people are employed for less money, they pay less tax. So like that costs the government shit tons of money. So abolishing the minimum wage is not a path out of homelessness, and it's definitely not a cost saving measure. I should address why it's not a path out of homelessness. It's also premised in the idea that, man, I'll tell you what, these governments, they really, really want to employ these homeless people. If only they could pay them a little bit less. No, that's not why companies don't want to hire these homeless people. It's because they're like things, for example, like employment contracts and, even like signing up to get tax, you need to put a place of residence. Like that's the first problem. Like many of the states we're talking about, like, we obviously both live in Australia, but even in America, there's welfare, and there's things you can sign up for, but you need a place of residence before you become eligible. So it's not a lack of funds, which is stopping these people clawing their way out of homelessness, because I hate to tell you, but living hand to mouth on a minimum wage job there's not a savings account, which again, you'd also need a place of residence to get, which turns into buying a house meat. So if you abolish the minimum wage, all you're going to do is you're going to impose huge externalities on everyone else in the population. You're not going to give these homeless people jobs because people still want to employ them because they're homeless. There are lots of people who would accept minimum wage jobs. Homeless people are the least attractive of those options because, they're probably not as cleanly, they're less trustworthy. People, the customers are scared by them, et cetera, et cetera. So really, none of that of what you said is a path out of homelessness. Let's do a quick comparison to what I'm talking about. You did say charities briefly, but I just think that it's going to be insufficient at the moment to do anything about the problem. And the proof of that is the charities exist and homelessness is still an issue. The main issue here is that you've got tons and tons of people who, it's not because they don't have a job, they're just kicked out of home, or they have a family member died, or they're a victim of domestic violence, who just don't have a place to go. And they don't have a huge savings account to buy a house, or perhaps they just live in the city and the house prices are so large that even to rent would require such a savings account that, in a competitive marketplace, they can never break in. And you're looking at those people, and it's not like, the problem you've illustrated is that, oh man, they just aren't enough park benches without dividers to sleep on. But that's not the problem. The problem is that they get assaulted and robbed by people, because when you're sleeping in the middle of the street with nothing to protect yourself, where you're even afraid to call the police because they'll probably come and arrest you as well, or that, you know what I mean? That's the issue. So it's pretty clear to me that the government should just fight for whatever money you needed. There was even remember that meme video of that kid, the British kid who's 6 years old and just has that 8-minute rant at Theresa May. She's like, I'm just walking through London and there's all these homeless people. Just give them a house. We generate X million dollars in revenue. I don't understand what, that I can count the homeless people on my 2 fingers. I think that the reason that video got so many likes is because people realize that it's such an obvious problem which needs to be fixed. And kind of just saying, oh yeah, we'll make the benches a little bit more comfortable isn't really going to cut it. So I'll pass back to you.
All right. So a couple of things to deal with. You're talking about externalities in terms of abolishing the minimum wage. I would point out that whatever policy that you try to implement in this thing is also going to have externalities. So just doing things like additional public housing or moving people into houses perhaps that are already built but are vacant because they've been reclaimed after like the subprime mortgage crash or other sort of things is also going to have externalities on the surrounding area about them, right? So like I think in any way that you try to implement some sort of policy to say that that this is going to have some sort of positive effect is also going to negatively affect other people. So maybe it's the case that the minimum wage going down is going to have externalities on people. I would say that a lot of people who are currently employed probably have like a sort of fairly stable employment, and that some reduction in the minimum wage isn't going to change the value of their labor. I would say that the people who are who are not homeless and who might as you say more attractive prospects or something, have the ability to sort of search around a little bit more. So maybe it's the case that if the minimum wage does that, we do get rid of it, right? You have these people that are more able to look for something that is actually worth their time and worth their labor cost to be able to find. So they get the sort of like still kind of like mid-tier jobs, leaving these sort of other employment prospects that still exist for the homeless. What I would say about specifically, the things about that you were saying, the problem isn't about there's not enough park benches to sleep on. It's the fact that like these people get assaulted and that they're too afraid to call the police because they're probably going to kind of come and harass them as well. That's exactly what I'm talking about. I think that there's extra state resources, unnecessary state resources being spent enforcing things like loitering laws and police like coming in and breaking up huge amount of homelessness. What I think that would be an effect of doing things of like making more areas where homeless people are able to sort of sleep, right? Like having like areas under bridges and stuff where you're not building those spikes and things. Because you tend to get conglomerizations of people who are having a hard time into a form of community. And those forms of community offer very effective protection for things like assault and other sort of things, right? Like you're familiar with the like that kind of like array of tents that we have up in that park that's near the central train station in Sydney and stuff. I would say that a lot of the reasons why people sort of conglomerate in those areas is because they find that people are likely to have sympathy with other homeless people because they can experience that they're also going through a lot of time. I would say that probably the kinds of assaults and crimes that get committed against these people, as you say, are from people who are kind of just like looking for like an easy score from the outside. I think that if you offer more situations for homeless people to be able to conglomerate, then in a large part you can actually solve those safety issues that they're having by offering a sort of protection in numbers.
Okay, but the problem is, first thing on the externalities point, you're basically like, aha, abolishing the minimum wage will have externalities, but government spending will also have externalities. Yeah, what externalities, Orion? Like the externalities of abolishing the minimum wage is going to be that every person working for Walmart gets their wages cut in half. Because I know you're like, oh no, they can shop around, the value of the labor hasn't changed. Like, you're a Marxist, you know that's not true, right? Like, what's going to happen? They don't have time to shop around, right? Because they're working 3 jobs. They lose one of them. That means no feeding their kids. So people compromise on the value of their labor all of the time because they don't have the time to shop around. And when all the business community knows that, they can all lower their wages at once, that's what they'll do because it saves them money. So the externalities which are going to be accrued onto, the people abolishing the minimum wage are going to be huge. The externalities accrued to people by, my policy, right? Like just spending more money on public housing is like tax dollars get reallocated. Well, like there aren't that many homeless people, yes, it's a huge problem because I think any amount of homelessness is a problem. But if the government, if they say it's eminent domain for public purpose, for repurposing houses which have been abandoned or whatever, the externalities on that population is just that their tax dollars get reallocated in a way which helps homeless people. That's not really much of an externality. If the government did that tomorrow, most people wouldn't even realize because the government wastes their money on things all of the time. It's not really an externality. So you can't just say, aha, we've both got externalities because the externalities of your policy are huge and disastrous and destroy families. And the externalities of my policy, people wouldn't even realize. The second thing you're saying is about how about like assault's not really a problem because like people can kind of create little tent communities. Well, like, I hate to say it, but like, one sleeping homeless person to a tent full of 4 sleeping homeless people is not really that much of a buffer against things like robbery and assault. Like, and not everybody is fortunate enough to kind of make these little homeless communities. there are just space requirements for one, but not everyone socializes well, and homeless people, I imagine, would probably be pretty wary of inviting other homeless people into the communities if they don't know them very well, because of the exact risks which I'm talking about. So, at best, your position is still one where people are probably not everyone is in these communities, and those communities aren't even that safe, because like 4 tents isn't really that much more safe than one. Like, your policy still has a lot of people who are just hungry, suffering, getting assaulted, and all of the associated litter problems and everything I was talking about with my policy. So with the status quo, and at least my side puts houses over people's heads. Yeah, back to you.
Right. So a couple of things. So I have some thoughts about specifically how this policy better enables charities to be more effective in actually providing parts out of homelessness. But I will just sort of address some of the specific externalities that I think comes from more sort of like government housing, or indeed moving people into houses that are currently unoccupied. The main effect that this has, right, is it really exacerbates this backlash under this kind of not in my backyard sort of attitude have, right? Like, people are really selfish. If they see that a bunch of like public housing is going up in their area, they're going to be like, one, really irritated that that's their tax dollars that's going to spending that. But B, they're also going to be really irritated that you now have this like community of not very well off people moving into their community, right? And what that does is that actually like sort of disincentivizes any kind of political capital that can be gained for future spending to help homeless people, because people are just like, oh, they're not trying to solve their problem, they're just moving it into like, my area, and this isn't something I want. My tax dollars, paid for this. This is really bad. And then you get more negative backlash, which is less likely to lead to more positive, policies in the future.
Yeah, all right. That's a case against welfare and all social safety nets.
So the difference between all welfare and all social safety nets and this policy in particular, right, is that this policy particularly ticks that sort of very like selfish want to be like disaffected from the ills of society, which other sort of welfare does. I think that people are quite happy to sit on this sort of like train of there's welfare being spent, it's probably just going to some person who's sitting on the couch playing Xbox. I'm a little bit irritated by that, but it's not actually going to be a huge deal. It's just something I like to bitch about at dinner parties, right? When you actually start moving those people into their communities, then that's when you start getting people actually...
There aren't that many of them, mate. Like you're talking about, like every person is going to have a previously homeless next door neighbor. They're going to hate them and they'll hate welfare. That's obviously not how it works. There just aren't that many. Maybe some people will move next door, but chances are they might just get to know them and they're going to be okay. So it's not going to on the other hand, the policy you're talking about of decriminalizing homelessness and having the benches, become permanent sleeping bags, that's what's going to viscerally affect people, because people have to walk by that every single day, right? Like the mum who takes their kids out for a walk in the park can't avoid seeing a homeless person sleeping on every bench. That's what's going to trigger the sort of backlash which you're worried about. So it's your policy which does that, not mine.
If it's the case that, as you say, that people getting to know people is going to be more likely to raise sympathy for them, and thus, increase the sort of political capital that they have for these policies, then I would say putting the homeless people in public areas where people can see their struggle and generate more sympathy is going to be a negative plus thing. The kinds of things that generate negative sympathy for them is visceral things that people can feel, specifically like their housing prices going down. Anytime you put public housing or other things in those areas, there's a tangible effect.
How many homeless people in the street do you see people going up to him like, oh, hi, my name's Bob, what's your name? That's not how it works. People don't talk to homeless people in the street because they're fucking scared of them.
When you have a guilt reaction, right?
When they're living, but they don't feel like, I'm guilty, I'm going to make friends. Like, just how many people do you know who have done this? We have both walked past homeless people before, often together, and not once have I ever seen you just introduce yourself. It doesn't happen. Right?
The fifth person I walk by, every person I walk by, I'm more likely to give them some change or donate to some sort of charity, because I can see their struggle and it generates.
That's not what we were talking about. We were talking about getting to know that person, not necessarily donating. If they live next door to you in a house, you often might not even know that they are homeless. They were previously homeless at first. That might actually just come out in conversation, and so it shatters that expectation window. So having the person live next to you in a house which is kind of reasonable is exactly the sort of gateway you need to socializing, because people just don't walk up to homeless people on the street and get to know them. That's not how it works, and that that's the truth.
All right, fair enough. Well, we have 30 seconds left. I'm just going to quickly...
Yeah, you're someone.
Okay, so what I think is happening is you remove all of these restrictions that I was pointing about, and you allow by scrapping the minimum wage, you're going to get more people have opportunities to employment. I think what that does is that really effectively utilizes the ability of charities to actually try and find people pass out of employment. Because if you see a lot of the things that the charities do, it's like giving them haircuts, dry cleaning, or giving them suits that they can wear to interviews. I think if you increase chances of employment, then those are going to be a lot.
All right, now you're on the affirmative.
All right, we're back. Okay, cool. Everyone who was watching, forget everything I ever said. It was garbage. So, obviously, homelessness is a huge problem. And despite my characterization, there's basically no reason that people should, in fact, be homeless. A lot of the times that, as was already pointed out, that the reasons why people lead into homelessness are things that are far beyond their control. Unemployment just caused by, general economic shifts as a result of domestic violence, huge just discrimination against families. Like a lot of trans people and queer people get kicked out of their houses when their family doesn't reject them anymore. This is obviously awful things that you should do against it, right? I would adopt a zero tolerance one as well, but I would also say that there is a lot more that could be done than simply just making sure that, people, all have housing, right? Because the first problem with the housing model is that it's far too long term, right? Like it's the second that someone gets kicked out, they need to, go through this whole process to figure out where am I going to sleep, where am I going to live going into the future. But still multiple nights when they're out on the street where they are, liable to be the victims of crimes. They could even just suffer from like the weather conditions. You have hundreds of homeless people freezing to death every year, which is an obvious blight on society. And so necessarily the thing that we need is more crisis shelters. You need places where people are able to go instantly the day that they are kicked out, because across many countries, crisis shelters are periodically full. And they've gotten so used to being full that they now carry stacks of blankets that they can give out to people who come to them, because they're aware that they're going to have to turn people away and they're just going to do what they do to try to freeze less. So I'd say more crisis shelters. I would increase funding for non-government organizations and provide more things that feed people. So just things like soup kitchens, making sure that people have a place to stay and have a place to eat. And I would also say that what we would be able to do, in addition to offering more public housing and be able to set these people up, that by having additional crisis centers and additional soup kitchens that are funded by the government, and there's an amount of government involvement, you can target very specific policies like welfare systems and employment agencies to people who clearly need them. So that is the extent that I would go to reduce homelessness. Ben, hit me with it.
Okay, so my new negative position on this is that I agree that we need more crisis centers and stuff. I just think the government is really, really shit, and that it shouldn't be involved in any way. So here's what I'm going to prove. The first thing I'm going to try and prove is that non-government organizations are way better at dealing with the specific problems of homelessness than the government is, and that 2, when the government gets involved, it fucks everything up, and 3, that we can't have both. So the first one, many of the issues with homelessness are not as simple as the people are out of money and can't afford a home. It's often way more complicated than that. Often a lot of these people are the victims of domestic violence, so they've had to leave their home, and they don't necessarily even, they're not even homeless for a long term. They're just homelessness for the short term until, for example, like a legal center sorts its shit out, right? So that what they need is not, for example, to sign up to a government waiting list and, have their claims meritocratically assessed. They just need something really, really short term, which will take them in no questions asked and then give them back, their home afterwards. The second thing is that, as you talked about, many of what these people need is like haircuts and blankets. Like this is exactly the sort of stuff the government bureaucracies are really bad at providing. And then the third thing as well is that, like, when the government wants to implement, for example, a new shelter somewhere, it's never as simple as we'll put it there. It's always, okay, we'll have to, we have to offer up a tender, and then they get extorted by all the private providers who, all know the government, what the government's budget is for these things. And then the next thing is that has to get approved by a slew of bureaucrats. It has to meet a certain amount of KPIs. And then maybe 3 years after it was needed, it gets built. And that by that time, the problem's moved on. What we need is money which moves fast, which moves decisively, which is what NGOs can do, because they can just, without the sort of broad government oversight and infrastructure, which is necessary, by the way, because it's necessary to protect against cronyism, but it means that the government always moves very, very slowly. We need people who move fast, and those people are going to be the NGOs. Second thing, what's the second thing I was going to say? I remember the third one was like kind of both. I think I've covered the second one. Third one, why we can't have both. The reason we can't have both, right, is that the NGOs and stuff get funding from basically two different avenues. One is applying for government grants, and the second is like running their own stores and stuff, and the third is like fundraising, and the third is like fundraising, like donations and stuff like that. It's way more efficient to just go for example, big name donors. So for example, they could target, for example, like celebrities who at one stage in their life were homeless, and some of them do exist, by the way, and are quite wealthy. Or they could, for example, just target the general guilt of the population, and that's why Salvation Army gets lots of funding. Many NGOs are also somewhat religious in nature and can kind of use tithing effects to get funding as well. It doesn't really matter where they get their money from, as long as they're getting it and they're getting it fast without conditions. When they get their money from the government, they instantly become the part of political scrutiny, right? Because when the government gives you money, suddenly there are like performance things which are tied to that money. The government has to become involved, and because it's not sexy to a population to say what homeless people need is haircuts, right? We know that's true because that can be the difference between a job or not. But you can't communicate that politically, right? It's like, imagine being the opposition party, just being like, they're wasting your taxpayer dollars on giving haircuts to the homeless. Is exactly the sort of crazy shit which gets people elected. So government money makes it harder for these NGOs to operate, because it strangleholds their ability to spend the money in the ways which are most effective, and instead forces them to spend the money in the way which is most politically palatable. And secondly, when you fund these things by the government, people feel like they've done their bit. So it's like you're less likely to donate to a homeless shelter, for example, if you're like, oh, well, my taxpayer dollars are already going to the homeless shelter. It's just that if you were to donate directly, that money would get a lot more value for money. So I just want the government to be kept out of it, and we'll put it in the hands of the people who are able, free from political restraints, to do what's best. Back to you.
Okay, no worries. So what I would argue here is that I think that in a lot of cases that the people setting up these crisis shelters and soup kitchens and other sort of things are going to be either partially non-government organizations or full non-government organizations. And I'd say the more things that they were helping to do would be increasing the grant applications, increasing the funding to those organizations. I understand your point about how this strangleholds their ability to be effective, but I will address that continuing on. Why I think specifically that actually linking them to governments is going to be good is because in addition to, implementing the sort of like standards that you were talking about, it also implements the kinds of like anti-discrimination and sort of broad reaching policies that governments are good at implementing. So you're saying that, for example, like that current organizations, some of whom are religious, can be really effective, like the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army is not a great thing that we should be funding in order to help homelessness, because in a lot of cases they're massively discriminatory. They don't give houses to trans women. They don't give houses to people within the queer community because it goes against their religious beliefs. And I think in a lot of cases you would find, these people who have these sort of religious beliefs behind this, that are going to find ways to exclude certain people from the community who in often cases need it most, and that is going to be really, really harmful. If you start making sure that they're predominantly that their funding is reliant on government, then you can have that funding being somewhat conditional. And I obviously wouldn't make it conditional in a way that I think restricts their ability to, provide these services. The kinds of conditions that I specifically would place on it is to be like, you cannot be discriminatory towards your housing practices. If people come to you saying, I am homeless, I don't have a place to sleep tonight, I need shelter, you need to provide those sort of things, doing the sort of no questions asked, as you were saying. Talking specifically now about non-government fundings in terms of like self-funding and grants and stuff, I think I would say that that's correct, that your analysis there is correct in terms of how non-governments get funded. I think that grants can be a really good way to do things, and that they don't fall into the sort of problems that you're describing. Mainly because the kinds of ways that non-government organizations go about getting their funding is that they apply through grant applications, and part of that grant application is going to be detailing what they're going to do with their money. So these organizations already have a lot of autonomy about the kinds of ways that they're going to spend their money, and probably have a good understanding of how they were going to be most effective with it. What I would say is that other kinds of restrictions that you would place on that is just sort of like having a list of priorities that you would be able to give grant funding to. Because while I agree it's appropriate that homeless people get haircuts, I think we can both agree that it's not as important as finding them a place to sleep off the streets so that they don't like freeze to death in the middle of the night. So if I was, implementing this sort of policy, I would say that, here are our priorities. One, getting people a place to sleep for the night. Two, making sure that people get food, and then other things like that is like increasing their chances of employment. Finding more sort of permanent accommodation, right? And you can have these as a list of priorities that you have, and then all that non-government agencies have to do is make sure that they're funding, make sure that the structure of their agency provides the most essential services before providing these secondary services. But the benefit that you get from this is that once these people are collectively in a place, it might alleviate the public's responsibility to do things like give funding or give donations to these things. But if we're getting the funding through tax dollars, that's not necessarily a harm. And I think that in a lot of cases, when you're looking for specialized services like haircuts and stuff, a lot of the haircuts that you see giving homeless people is actually just co-opting other people within the community or other businesses within the community to do that. So these non-government organizations will go to hairdressers and say, hey, would you like to partner with us and give people these haircuts for free? Or they'll go to dry cleaners and say, hey, would you like to partner with us and you can, dry clean these things for free? And in turn, that will be positive advertising to you because you'll be seen as beneficial within the community. So I don't think it curtails their ability to get funding. I think that, if anything, it just makes sure that funding is going to be spent in a way that is like reasonably prioritized.
All right. So here's the thing. First thing you said, government should only fund non-discriminatory agencies. First thing I'm going to say here is that cuts out many of the agencies, right? Like, and I think it's going to be a political shitstorm, and the sort of one which I want to avoid, which you're encouraging when you say, aha, we are going to not fund the Salvation Army, despite the fact that they have enormously good publicity with lots of people. So like, that's the sort of political football which I don't want to enter the debate, right? Because the government will say, okay, we're not going to fund the discriminatory because they're like, too Christian. Then the Christian lobby is like, well, what the fuck? What about all of the Christian homeless people? And then that becomes the center of the debate rather than actually helping people. The second thing I'd say is that sometimes it's actually like, not that I'm a fan of discrimination, but sometimes it's necessary. So for example, I know a lot of homeless crisis centers are having massive problems with trans people at the moment. Not because they don't like trans people, because they're trying to run women-only crisis shelters. And there are lots of people rocking up saying, I identify as a woman. But their presence there, because they're still biologically male, makes that space inaccessible, for example, Muslim women who can't operate effectively in a space which has like biological males in it. So some of the discrimination you're talking about really can't be avoided. And if you are going to, push forward this somewhat politically correct government imposition of no discrimination, then you're going to shut down a lot of you're going to have other forms of discrimination which are invisible. So you might be more welcoming to trans people, but you shut down all of the crisis centers which would be accessible for Muslim women. And that's the sort of thing which is lost in the political debate, because you just have someone who gets on the soundbite of I won't discriminate, and then they completely ignore the externalities of what that policy entails. Second thing is you said, aha, well, look, I've backflipped on my haircuts thing now. Freezing to death more important. That's what I'm talking about. It's very easy politically to say, well, I'd rather them not freeze to death than get them haircuts. But that's the same fallacy as saying we should give the, we should teach the, homeless person to, we should give them food rather than teach them how to farm, right? Like sometimes the secondary services are, yes, in the short term, less pertinent, but in the long term, they're actually cost saving, because if you spend a bit of money to give someone a haircut and that gives them a job, and then they no longer require your services anymore, that actually allows you to give your services to more people, as opposed to what you're talking about, where you just alleviate everyone out of freezing, but then they're all stuck in this area where they can't quite get a job. And that's the sort of hard trade-off, which doesn't make sense in a political soundbite, which only makes sense for a completely autonomous, no government strings attached, non-government organization. The next thing you tried to say then is that, the secondary services are free, but they're not always free. Like you can't just rely on the haircut people and the dry cleaners doing everything for free. Often, people doing haircut, people running like hairdressers and dry cleaners aren't exactly living in the Ritz. They're not high rollers in society. Often they're the first people who, when push comes to shove and they need to, and maybe it's a bad season, the first thing they're going to cut is the support for the homeless. So you do need to spend money on these things. Not everything is free. The last thing you said was, yes, you give up the people's ability to fund, but you get your tax dollars, so it's kind of evens out. The problem is, I agree, it does even out. You could get the money from appealing to people, or you could get the money from getting it from tax. When you get it from people, you get the sort of free charge of that money, which allows you to spend it with the most value, and it also gives you it the fastest, which is something you didn't address from earlier. when you have to apply through a grant application, right? And you even said this, you have to meet the conditions of that grant application. You have to actually spend money buying like a consultant or a lobbyist to, you know, or like a lawyer to prove to the government that the money will be spent in the way in which the government wants it to. So it forces you to, it actually forces you to spend money to get the money. And then once you've got the money, it can only be spent in ways in which it was approved by the grant. So if circumstances change, right? Say, you know, yet today's best strategy for fighting homelessness was haircuts, but then, you know, tomorrow it's something else, right? The grant application locks you in often for long periods of time. Whereas if you just got the money from the public, you could spend it quickly, you could spend it decisively, and that's what will lead to the best outcomes. I'll toss it back to you so we can have one.
Yeah, okay, cool. So I think that the kind of like opportunity cost of like haircuts versus freezing to death thing is like a little bit disingenuous, right? Because obviously it's the case that like it is something that we can just do both. The point that I am implementing, the point that I'm stressing here is that if you need to make sure that people are off the street so they're not victims of violence from, you know, from crimes and other sorts of things like that. You need to make sure that they're not victims to the weather, because unless you ensure their safety in that way, there's no way that they're ever going to be able to actualize the benefits of a haircut or any other kind of thing that can lead to their employment, right? As far as them being trapped in a situation that they can't get out of, I think that it's kind of a bit inconceivable, right? That like, you know, that someone who was homeless manages to get themselves off the street into a crisis center nearby a soup kitchen where they're able to now, you know, have a place to sleep where they're not going to get beaten or frozen to death, and then have something to eat for, you know, a couple of meals a day so they don't starve to death, and then suddenly go, oh, well, my life is great now, I think I'm just going to stay here. Like, they're not going to be stuck there. If anything, as my earlier point points out, you now have these people sort of conglomerating in an area where, you know, the kinds of organizations and the kinds of initiatives that do things like try to give them haircuts or set them up with employment opportunities are going to be much more effective in being able to reach them than otherwise they were before. So what I'm just saying is that, yes, I do think it's appropriate to prioritize getting them off the streets and getting them fed before doing things like haircuts and stuff, because what you do is you run the risk of people being in situations where they are not actually able to actualize any of the benefits the haircuts will get, like longer term employment and stuff. And the benefit of having increased crisis centers and increased places where people can go is that at the point where someone has recently become homeless, that is the point where it is easiest for them to exit that cycle, right? The longer that someone has been homeless for them, the more that their problems compound and the more that they, you know, have to, you know, work harder to be able to get out of that. So if you have a widespread knowledge that when you become homeless, that there is a crisis center that you can go to and you can provide immediate accommodation, you can start formulating a way to get back on your feet, that is going to be very effective in the long term to getting people, as you say, out of those crisis centers and back onto the streets. Because the problem that you're having at the moment is that crisis centers do have like 3 month, 6 month waiting periods to actually get people in. And by the time that homeless people come in there, they're in no state to try to do anything to get themselves back on their feet. And they do need that extra support to be able to do that. Specifically talking about why the fastest...
20 seconds, go 20 seconds as well, so I have time to summarize, but yeah.
Specifically thinking about grants and fastest speed, the way that grants work is they work in a planned out sort of sequence. So as the money from this grant is running out, you're already applying for the next grant. And you don't need things like lawyers and stuff to do it. Like these organizations rely on grant funding. They have people who are very, very experienced at getting this grant funding in the first place. They're probably on staffers that half of their job is applying specifically for grants. So they are in fact the best people to apply for grants are the people who are already working there.
Okay. Here we go. So first thing I'm going to do is deal with the secondary services thing. So haircuts, resume training, like basic education, stuff to get people these jobs. You admitted that these crisis centers have waiting periods. The reason they have waiting periods is because the crisis center and the homeless shelter it becomes diminishingly less helpful the more people go in. So if you were to prioritize taking in every single homeless person, you know, to prioritize them not freezing or to prioritize them, you know, not getting assaulted, it actually leads to the homeless center becoming useless because they become overcrowded. They themselves become, basically unlivable because, you know, you have the same problems which you would have outside. So the reason they have the waiting periods is precisely because of that. And that way people don't even want to go to them anymore. Like many assaults happen in homeless centers when they become overcrowded. So it's not good enough to just say we need to prioritize freezing. It takes making politically unpalatable decisions like implementing waiting lists, which means that some people will freeze, like spending money on someone's education over feeding someone for the first time because it means that that person leaves the homeless center and actually creates room for the next person.
Those are really, really difficult decisions. Those are ones which are politically unpalatable, but are completely necessary to stop the sort of overcrowding and overburdening of these crisis centers and homeless shelters, which make them no better than the streets from, from where their residents came from. So yes, that's why these people need the freedom to make those tough decisions, because they will never be justified politically. Second thing, you're talking about grant people. It's like, oh, it doesn't cost you anything. They even have the grants guy who their entire job is to apply for grants. Well, that's one person who could be doing something more useful than dealing with government bureaucrats all day, right? Like, you know, and you do need to pay these people. Like the grants person doesn't spend all day applying for grants for free, right? But they need to be paid as well. So otherwise, like, how are they going to feed their family? So yes, and it's not just the process of applying for the grant, which is the problem. It's once you get the money, you then can only spend it in the way in which the grant's stipulated, which, you know, is a massive problem. So the summary for my case is, like, it's good. We do want to support the homeless, but the government is terrible. It's full of bureaucrats, and we need to do it